Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful scene. It's from the cliffs on the southeast of England in East Sussex, just near Seaford or Burling Gap on the west side of the Cuckmere Valley. It's a place that I visit a lot, and a lot of my paintings come from this area because it's so beautiful. This is a rugged and desolate landscape looking east this way. As you can see from my photograph here, there's no sort of sandy beach as such. It's just a rock-strewn sort of wilderness, really. So I'm going to try and capture that sort of atmosphere today using a limited palette. So as always, the first thing that I'll do is look carefully at the photograph and try and pull out the most important elements. And today it's the horizon, the cliffs, obviously the sky, the sea and the rocky beach. And those are my main elements. So I put my horizon line in about a third of the way up from the bottom of the paper, and then rough in my other shapes, keeping it nice and simple. Please excuse me if you hear any sort of any noise in the background. We've got builders round at the moment. They can be a little bit noisy, so sorry about that. Right, back to the painting. Today I'm using Millford 100% cotton watercolour paper. It's cold pressed, which means it's got a nice texture, and this is a quarter imperial sheet, which is 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. I've got it taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape. My board is set at an angle of 45 degrees. I like to stand up and paint, and this is a really nice angle when you're standing. It also works well for filming. I don't pre-stretch my paper. I find that at 140 pounds weight or 300 GSM, then it's absolutely fine if you tape it to a board and wet it, paint on it, and then as it dries, it flattens out. If I was using a larger sheet of paper, then I'd probably pre-stretch. The pencil I'm using is a carpenter's pencil, and it's got quite a sort of a wide, splayed out lead, and this keeps me loose. If I was painting with a delicately pointed pencil, I might be tempted to get into too much detail, and then you can run into some problems. If you're looking to paint a loose painting, if you draw in a bit too much detail, you can sort of end up with a bit of a slightly fussy sort of painting, if you see what I mean. So keeping just the basics, like the cliff, sort of delineating between the different parts of the cliffs as they go off into the distance, and the sort of putting in some of the rocks and details, but not too much. And now I'm using a 1.5 inch Princeton Aqua Elite modeler. It's a lovely flat brush, a synthetic brush, and it works in the same way as a Harkey brush or any kind of large flat wash brush does. So I'm going to wet my sky. I'm going to cut around the cliffs and not wet them just yet, because I want to keep them slightly lighter than the rest and hard edged. So I will put some of the initial wash onto them, but I don't want to soak them. This is yellow ochre. You could use raw sienna, and it's just to put in a little bit of a glow in the sky, so that when I put the greys in, they've got something to work against, sort of like reflected sunlight on the clouds. And I'm just pulling a bit of that, quite a watery mixture, across above the horizon into the cliffs, as you can see, and a little bit below. Keeping my brush strokes mostly horizontal at the moment, and you can see on the wet paper the paint is softening beautifully. Now this is a bit of indigo, a bit of Paynes grey. I want it to be a fairly strong mixture to get a good colour onto the sky. Not too dark, but remember my paper is wet, so the paint will dilute a little bit when I put it on, and as it dries it will soften back and lighten. So you want to go in with a slightly sort of bolder, richer mix than you maybe think you do, because it'll always lighten back. So I'm bringing in my clouds now, working around the white of the paper and where I've just taken the edge off it with the yellow ochre, and giving it a little bit of a glow, and just trying to make sure that I can get this nice sort of subtle but brooding sky coming across the top of the cliffs. And then I can bring that same colour down into the sea, so I can start off that wash, leave a few sort of gaps for a bit of fresh sparkle on the water of sort of the unpainted paper showing through. And then working quite quickly while the sky wash is all still wet, but not with a wet mixture. I haven't added any water to my brush, so I'm just adding little bits of paint here and there. If I use a wet brush here, I'll create cauliflowers if it's wetter than the wash that's on the paper. So I'm making sure that I dab my brush off onto a tissue to remove any excess water before I go into the painting, and just kind of lightening it up across the horizon, making sure it's just a little bit darker behind the cliffs, that sort of thing. So I'm just like finessing the sky. I just want a little bit more dark introduced into there, because it will lighten up a little bit. So I want to make sure it's just not too light. Again, just coming out and disappearing behind the cliffs. So I'm taking it off across the tape rather than just stopping before the tape, and that makes sure that it looks like the sky goes beyond the painting. And now, just before I leave it all to dry, I'm going to mix up some indigo, Paynes grey and burnt umber, quite watery, but still well pigmented, and draw it in horizontal streaks across the beach area. And this is going to give me a good underpainting, hopefully, for the rocks. I want it to be a bit paler in the distance generally, and a bit less detailed, and more detailed rocks in the foreground. So I'm sort of setting the scene for that, although there will be, the headland across the horizon will be reasonably dark, but it will also be quite narrow. So I'm just looking to build up, as I say, this sort of background for the beach. It will lighten back quite considerably, and then I should be able to go in with some nice details once it's completely dry. This is my 3/4 inch flat brush, and I can use it just to sort of soften back in places, still working horizontally, and that keeps the lay of the land flat. I want the beach to feel very flat, although the flatness is going to be disrupted by the rocks. So I'm going to flick some water into that area with my fingers to deliberately create some tiny little blooms or cauliflowers, and that will start off the textures for the rocks. And I think I'm going to mix up some yellow ochre, quite an inky consistency, and I'm going to spatter into the wet paint. So I'm using a technique that my daughter Morgana showed me, which is to use a fan brush and to then use the inky consistency paint and tap the fan brush onto the handle of a larger brush, and that gives me some targeted and really nice little spatter marks, which you can see are softening into the painting. And I forgot to mention that I've laid my board flat for that spattering to keep those marks sort of from running down the page. So now it needs to dry completely. So here it is, it's completely dry. Sorry about the slight change in light. It's a bit stormy outside, so the light coming in through the windows isn't quite as good. I've lifted my board back up to 45 degrees, and you can see that I've stuck a bit of masking tape just over my horizon line, and that will help me to get a really nice sharp headland, which is what I'm looking for now, that very dark fine headland right on the horizon line. And for this I'm using the tips of my 3/4 inch synthetic flat brush, which is really useful. Just try and keep a steady hand and just draw along the edge of the tape. This is a mixture again of indigo, Paynes grey and burnt umber. And I'm going to be alternating between the flat brush and a small squirrel mop, which is just damp and clean, which I'll use to soften back those lines, keeping those sort of narrow horizontal bands for the distant headlands, kind of dotting off as the rocks disappear into the water, and then kind of sort of softening back to nothing across the main area of the beach. And I can always gently dab back with a little bit of tissue if I think that the distance is looking a bit dark. I want it to be sort of pale enough and narrow enough to indicate depth and distance, but it still needs to be really quite dark. So I'm trying to find a balance between being dark enough and too dark, if you see what I mean. And then carrying forward, softening back, and continuing to bring those sort of marks and suggestions of rocks across this beach area. It's a bit difficult to see, but I'm trying to vary up the tones as well. I'm using a little bit more indigo in some parts and a little bit more burnt umber in others, so that I can get this sort of dark tone, but that's not too flat and dull, but it's got a little bit of life and changes of colour, even in the distance. And then keeping on sort of bringing those lines across and then changing to some yellow ochre that's kind of mixed with a little bit of those other colours to bring it down a little bit and darken it, and just to sort of put in some slightly lighter areas below the cliffs on the right in the sort of mid-grounds of the beach. But making sure it stays nice and soft at this stage, softening it back with the squirrel mop. And then a little bit more dark, because the paint is still damp, so I can drop in some sort of fairly rich, tiny bits of dark, which will diffuse and soften, but just give me the shadows that I need in the distance and that depth of tone. I think what's really beautiful about this painting is the way that sort of the rocky headland in the distance contrasts against the sky. And now I'm going to use some much richer, drier paint. So if my brush feels too wet, I'm going to dab it off onto my paper towel to remove any excess water. But I'm dipping mostly into almost tube consistency paint, just with a little bit of water, and using the tips of this flat brush to get in some stronger rock shapes. Still keeping the orientation horizontal to keep the land looking flat, and to try and create the look of the rocks sort of running into the edges of the sea and just disappearing into the surface of the water, if you see what I mean. So I'm varying up my darks here, but still keeping it pretty dark. I want to scrape out some rocks with the corner of a plastic card. So I'm keeping the paint nice and rich. You can see that if I scrape the card across, it scrapes off some paint, moves some of it, so that you get some darker edges and some lighter bits. I'm almost back to the white paper, but not quite. It's stained by the wash that dried underneath. and it's giving me some nice variety and impressions and suggestions of these rocks in the foreground. So I've got a stronger foreground appearing through using this etching technique. And then back to painting in a few of the little shadows, a few more rocks in between where I've etched. And some smaller suggestions of rocks, slightly paler in the midground, and then also to put in a few more little hints and suggestions of the rocks leading into the sea at low tide. Now, just before I remove the masking tape across the horizon, I'm using some indigo on my flat brush and I'm darkening up the water below the horizon line, and that will show off those lovely light clouds and the dark line of rocks on the horizon. I'm bringing the indigo across, but I'm making sure I leave some white of the paper showing between my horizontal brush strokes as I come forward, and putting those around the rocks so it looks as if there's sparkle on the water and light reflected just on the low tide line where the water meets the rocks. And now to carefully peel off the masking tape to sort of reveal that nice line of rocks and a nice flat darkened sea. And so back in with a clean damp flat brush, I have wiped it on a paper towel so it's not too wet. I can feather out and soften some of those parts where the sea meets the headlands and the rocks. Now the next job is going to be to paint the cliffs, so I'm going to leave the rocks and sea to dry completely so I don't smudge them. So once everything is dry, I'm going to try and treat the cliffs quite simply, and mostly, if I can, using dry brush, which means that I'm going to skip the belly of the brush, a flat brush in this case, with fairly dry paint over the texture of the paper, and try and use the texture of the paper to give me this sort of hit and miss look. And I shall use a combination of vertical, horizontal, and the tips of the brush sort of lines here and there to try and build up the look of these cliffs. And to try and get some difference in the texture showing between the look of the cliffs with all the dry brush and the treatment that I've given to the rocks and the stones, which have been painted and etched sort of quite boldly in the foreground. There is a slightly darker tone across the top of the cliffs, which is where some grass is growing over and there's a few little bushes and things. I don't want to paint that very overtly. I just want to suggest the cliffs receding off into the distance and keep it very, very simple. But I'm changing up my tones and my hues, working mostly with the yellow ochre and bit of Payne's grey and my burnt umber. Just trying to sort of build this up without completely covering everything. I hope you can see the dry brush effects that where I'm sort of skimming over. It's almost sort of a dotty texture, but because I'm using horizontal and vertical brush strokes, I'm hoping to kind of suggest the texture, sort of the splitting and the lines and the sort of strata in the cliffs. I'm trying to keep the paint paler and simpler as I go further back, in the hope that I can use aerial perspective to give me that sense of depth and distance. I've now changed to a smaller flat brush. It's 1/2 inch flat brush, and I'm using the tips and some dark rich paint to bring in some boulders and a bit of tone at the base of the cliffs, to sort of bed those cliffs into the beach a little bit more. And now sort of continuing on this theme of trying to sort of harmonise things, back to my 3/4 inch flat brush, which has got a really nice chisel edge, and I'm going to just kind of define the distant headland a little bit more, and some of the rocks that go out, stretch out into the sea in the distance and the middle distance, and then a little bit more on the beach as well. So it's sort of at the moment a bit of a balancing act, trying to bring the painting together but without overdoing it. So throughout the whole painting I've used a limited palette. The colours that I've used have been indigo, paynes grey, although not much paynes grey, it's mostly indigo here, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and I think that's about it. So just using those colours in varying mixtures and also by themselves has given me this lovely painting that sort of harmonises. There's a harmony throughout the painting because I've used the same colours mixed throughout. So we've got the yellow ochre, the indigo and the paynes grey in the sky, and we've got those same colours but dry brushed across the cliffs, which give us that harmony with the sky and the land. The same with the rocks, although there's a lot more tone in the rocks introduced, getting those really dark colours with the paynes grey, indigo and the burnt umber. So I think I'm more or less finished now. I might have to make a few adjustments, but I want to have a look at it without the tape, see it with a clean white border, which helps us to sort of look at the painting with fresh eyes. So here it is with its clean white border. I've decided to dry brush the mid-ground of the beach with a little bit of yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of burnt umber. Just going to wipe it off the white border there. Once that's dry, I can probably sort of scrub that off so it doesn't show. And I think that harmonises the beach a little bit more. And standing back and looking at it, I think there's a little bit in the distant beach that needs to be just sort of lightened up, and I need to lift a little bit of paint off it. If you look closely, about in the middle of the page, just below the horizon line, it's a bit too dark and blocky. So I think what I'm going to do is, using a clean damp brush, is I'm going to sort of just move the paint around there, using horizontal brush strokes and just the tips, so to redistribute the paint, maybe wipe it off a bit with a tissue gently in a horizontal orientation again, so I don't spoil the painting, and it just takes down that tone a little bit more, and I think that's less of a distraction. I think I could probably fiddle around with it quite a bit more, but I think it's really good just to stop at a point like this, because even though I think I sort of probably overworked the dry brush a bit and some of the beach areas, I still think it's quite fresh, and I think it captures the moment that I wanted to of that beautiful area, and I think will be a good sort of stepping stone for me should I wish to paint it again. I can use what I've learnt from this painting to create a slightly different one. The colours here are the colours that the painting looks like in real life. The filming, the light was a little bit dodgy because it's been quite stormy here, and I think it sort of yellows out my picture a little bit for some reason. So thank you so much for watching and for your support here. I really appreciate it. And let me know what you think in the comments. I always look forward to reading your comments and replying to as many as I can of them, but I do read them all. So thanks again, and please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.